welcome to the second session of the 2021 Green Webinar Series, where we'll be talking about the past, the present, the future power of sustainable agriculture in achieving zero hunger. You know, they say that an hungry man is an angry man. And the issue of agriculture is interconnected to every socio-economic activity in every society. And at this crucial point that we have in the world today, it is important that agriculture not only provide food for us, but also do it in a right and sustainable manner for the people and for the planet. Now, join me as I welcome the host for today's session in the person of Dorcas Abimbola Omole. She's an agronomist and a co-founder of Enable Aging Women. Welcome, Abimbola. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Temitope. Hi, everyone. My name is Dorcas Omole, and I'll be your host for this event. This event is a series of webinars organized by the 111112 Foundation. The 111112 Foundation is an independent African NGO committed to improving the overall quality of the environment.
Bonjour à tous. J'espère que vous allez bien. Au fait, lorsque la présentatrice sur la puissance de l'agriculture pour
The objective of this webinar is to promote environmental education and communication related to environmental issues, and to bring to attention the advantages of the integration of environmental concerns into policies, plans, programs, and projects for economic and social development. So join us this week, and I would also appreciate if we can all mute our mics while having this conversation. So shortly, I will be our social media handles: Instagram at EET_Foundation, at Facebook 111112 Foundation, Twitter at EET_Foundation, and our website is www.eetfoundation.org. Then the hashtags, official hashtags for the event are the hashtag Green Hangouts, hashtag 2021 African Green Grants, hashtag 2021 African Green Awards, and hashtag 2021 Green Webinar Series. So shortly, please tag us on all of your tweets on Twitter and Instagram, and be sure to also keep the social media platforms active about this webinar. So this event will be lasting for 2 hours, and it will be recorded. It will also be broadcasted via our Facebook page live. Then audiences can use the chat box to ask questions, and panelists are free to answer any question in the chat box if they so wish. But we'll be taking some of our own answered questions later during the Q&A session. There is also a French translation. To listen in French, click on the translation button on the lower right corner of your screen. So we'll have 2 facilitators joining us during this webinar, and we have Kathy and Nora joining us. Kathy H. Watson is the Chief of Partnership for the Center for International Forestry Research and the World Agroforestry, ICRAF. She was Chief of Program Development for World Agroforestry from 2012 to 2020. She has worked over 30 years in Africa. Her current role is across the global south, and she's committed to building public understanding of the roles of trees in nutrition, poverty, and disaster risk reduction, and stemming the climate crisis and biodiversity collapse. And Nora Berahomoni, please forgive if I did not pronounce these names correctly, is the Senior Forestry Officer for Africa, FAO Regional Office in Africa. She leads FAO Regional Office work on sustainable forest management, forest and landscape restoration, and supports the implementation of African Great Green Wall. She's also a focal point for climate change and biodiversity in sub-Saharan Africa. Please, like I said earlier, we would have, except you are called upon to speak, that will be the only exception for you to unmute your microphones. And we'll also be engaging the speakers immediately. So I'll be talking to Kathy and Nora, and I'll also be asking some series of questions. Do not forget to drop your questions in the chat comments, in the chat box during the event, and all questions will be taken during the question and answer session. Thank you very much once again for joining us. So to Nora, that was a fantastic bio, and Kathy, that was also a very intense, if I could say that myself, bio. Quickly, what I'll be asking Nora this question first, because she seems to work with the FAO regional office here in Africa. So what are the key considerations for achieving sustainable and resilient food system in Africa? Over to you, Nora.
Thank you very much, Dorcas, and colleagues and partners here together, and also to the audience for having me. What a wonderful question to start with. I think that is really very important, and the considerations actually for achieving sustainable and resilient food systems in Africa are really wide and multiple. First, I think I wanted just to make sure that everybody puts attention into the word system. So we are talking really about systems, from the production of food, to the processing and handling, to the trade and markets across the value chains, to the consumer, who will be receiving the food on his or her table. So the consumer behavior, the choice of the food, and as well as looking at the different sectors. We are not talking here only about the agriculture sector, in isolation, but looking really at other sectors. And here also talking about agriculture, we include the forestry, the fisheries, the livestock production systems, and aquaculture, and many other sectors like environment, like finance, like trade, like land use planning, like social protection, women, youth, etc., and the finance. So it's really wide. So I think it's a very good, let's say, opportunity for us, to look at it, really as a system. And so our motto here, of course, the consideration is from one side, of course, as we say in FAO, to have a better production for better nutrition, but also at the same time, we need to make sure that we have a better environment, also a better life and livelihoods for the people, and leaving no one behind. So, and if you look at the food production currently, even at global level, at global scale, if we have to really respond to the needs for food and to feed the planet, we need to increase the current production by 50% compared to the 2012 level. And this without degrading the biodiversity and the natural resources, and also with the need in limiting, the greenhouse gas emissions. And we need to consider not only the quantity that we produce, but also the quality what we produce, and also the diversity that we are really looking for. Currently, Africa has 350 million hectares of croplands that are cultivated. So this is really more than 2 times or twice the area cultivated in the European Union. And 10% of this cropland is irrigated. So the 90 other percent are really, counting on rains, so it's rain fed. And we have seen, and this is of course based on an assessment we have done with many partners in Africa lately, and we released in July 2021. We've seen that there is like 17 million hectares of new cropland emerging since 2000. So this means that there is an increase of the land for croplands, but this is at the expense of forests, of grasslands, on other natural ecosystems. So what can we do, and how we can really make sure that we have really a sustainable pathway, a resilient pathway for this agriculture food system? So that's why we really need to as I said, and you talked about biodiversity, we need to take care of the natural capital, which is the biodiversity that we have, which is the basis really for food production, and also not only from the part of the variety of the agro-biodiversity, so the crops, the varieties that we need to use for food, or also from the wild food products, like from the plants, from the forest, from the grasslands, etc. But also looking at the ecosystem services that forests and many other natural ecosystems are providing in order to ensure sustainable food production. So we should not really take our biodiversity in Africa as for granted. So we need really to also invest into conserving and protecting, sustainably use the biodiversity and restore it, restore this extraordinary rich biodiversity at all levels, whether it's at the genetic level, the species, the ecosystems. And it becomes more and more than urgent really to take into consideration and to see agriculture not as a driver anymore of biodiversity loss, but to transform it to be a solution maker, and making sure that within agriculture, food system, we take into consideration its protection, its sustainable use and restoration. And
Hello.
And mainly, this is really possible, and especially in Africa, we should really remind ourselves that African farmers, have been really working and using
Hello.
biodiversity friendly practices, and traditional knowledge are already known and being implemented, including what we call currently, agroecology. This is something that our farmers have been really using. Agroforestry, diversification of systems, like using what we call, including agriculture with forest and trees and pastoral landscapes, and sustainable management of resources, combining science with really the traditional knowledge and practices that farmers have to offer. And with the diversity comes the well-being, the health, and a good nutrition, a balanced nutrition. And the other consideration I would make is really related to we are really, how can I say, jumping into a great opportunity, because even if we have many challenges and many threats, we need to use those with all these different crises that we have, the COVID-19, the climate change, degradation, desertification, biodiversity loss. We need to use these as really a booster, to act positively on nature and to act positively on sustainable production systems. And with it, we have, for example, currently the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration that has been launched in 2021, and it will really continue to be active till 2030. That really provides a very good opportunity to reverse the ways of production and to restore the degraded land in Africa in order to turn them to fertile land and make sure that we really support the biodiversity and conserve this biodiversity. So really, I think it's really very important. And within Africa already, we have some regional, we need to build, to take into consideration these Pan-African initiatives that have already started, you know, to boost restoring these lands with the communities on the ground. For example, I just give the example of the Africa's Great Green Wall or the African Forest Landscape Restoration Initiatives. That is also both initiatives, actually the Great Green Wall and AFR 100 are looking at restoring at least 100 million hectares by 2030. But of course, this needs to be followed by action, and already we see some action on the ground. And finally, maybe another consideration I would make, just, you know, to keep it short, we talked about the natural capital, the biodiversity and the land, but also we need to look at the human capital. So making sure that we develop policies and investments, that governments develop policies and investments with partners to enable farmers access to technical and financial support and in order to change and to scale up the good practices that they have been really steward for a long, long time. And to do that, of course, we need countries, communities, and smallholders and individuals, whether they are men or women, young or older, wiser, they are really, when they are provided with support that allows them to prioritize their resilience, they are really better able to control and reduce the impact, for example, of climate change, of degradation and disaster risks on their livelihoods. So these benefits, these benefits can only be realized when farmers, the forest dependent people, the fishermen and fisherwomen, and are incentivized to adopt really risk-driven and informed integrated farming systems using agroecological approaches, better forest governance and land use planning, shift to approaches that safeguard biodiversity, and use, again, of course, and more importantly, natural resources, whether they are soil, water, and also the plants and the animals that are supporting our systems. And finally, when talking to finance and investments, you know, we are now jumping and embarking in, you know, very soon, next week, there will be the Africa Climate Week as a preparation for the UNFCCC COP, you know, so the climate change conference in November in Glasgow. So I think a lot has to be done more on really making sure that climate finance plays an important role in this respect and support the sustainable agriculture and resilient, sustainable and resilient agriculture food systems, because without finance, we cannot really go ahead, and we need longer term finance coming from, of course, the domestic finance from the ministries and the opportunities existing in the countries, but also supported by the international community and by many partners, whether they are public or private, including, for example, the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility, and many, many others. I think I will stop here because I could, you know, continue to talk for a long time. So I know also to give the chance to other colleagues to come in and complement this talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nora, for your intensive and holistic approach to achieving sustainable and resilient food system in Africa. You were quite diverse with your approach and your comment, and that was really that's really needful and helpful. Climate change is one of the greatest challenges facing us, and it will definitely impact agriculture in many ways, and although positively and negatively. So and resilience to climate change will be a key need in achieving sustainable agricultural systems in coming decades, as especially in regions that are prone to severe ecological shifts due to climate change. So quickly, Kathy, I want to jump to you. Do you think payments for ecosystem services, green water credits, biodiversity enrichment, do you think it could lead to adoption of recommended land use management practices by resource poor farmers in developing countries? Do you think it's an approach that could work?
Okay, thanks so much, Dorcas. That's a really, really good and very specific question. And I just want to start by saying thanks so much for inviting me. And I greet everybody who's on this call. And I can see we've got Nigerian names, but I think we maybe even have some Kenyan names in there, or maybe like East African names, which is really great. So that's a good question about PES, Payment for Ecosystem Services. And I just want to start by saying I am a huge supporter of cash transfers, of payments to people. I was just having a conversation this morning with the big Dutch bank, Rabobank, because they want to bring smallholder farmers into the carbon market so they can get paid for growing trees on their land. That's a kind of payment for ecosystem services, right? You'll benefit by having the trees, but you're also benefiting the whole world by having the trees on your land because they're capturing carbon. So I'm a huge fan of that. And I was discussing what we were going to say. Nora and I were talking before this whole thing started today. I want to say that I agree absolutely with all that broad picture that Nora presented, incredible insights. And I wanted to go like super specific and talk about sustainability and one particular crop that I know is very important in West Africa, which is cashew, right? So what Nora was saying is that, you know, we can't expand too much at the expense of forests. And that may sound like an idealistic thing, but I was just in Northern Ivory Coast and you've got cashew spreading. Cashew is a tree. It's brought a lot of wealth to people, but it's clearing, the expansion of cashew is clearing natural forest, right? So what pollinates cashew? That's the problem, right? Is that cashew going to be sustainable? Because you need natural vegetation for those solitary bees, honey bees, stingless bees, all those different things that actually pollinate cashew, right? They need a nesting site and they need pollen and nectar from trees and from plants that are flowering when the cashew isn't flowering. They can't live on the cashew flowers alone. So what you see is it's not really sustainable, right? And you also see that you begin to get pests because there's no places for the birds, and the birds are the ones which are removing the pests. So this is where we need to think about nature and agriculture, and nature is really sort of at the heart of sustainability. Even ants, for example, I was talking to an Ivorian entomologist yesterday, and they were saying that ants are fantastic predators on pests, right? So when you start using pesticides and fertilizers on the ground, you start affecting your ants populations, and then you get more pests on your cocoa or on your cashew. Strangely enough, ants don't pollinate cocoa, but when you exclude ants from a cocoa plot, like in an experiment, you have a fall in production of cocoa, and that's because there are more pests, right? So this is why we have to think in these really joined up, what we call agroecological, so agriculture, but ecology altogether, ways about sustainability. So I'm a big, you know, Dorcas, you asked me a very specific question. I'm a big fan of payments for ecosystem services. I think cities and big companies like Coca-Cola and the breweries that use a lot of water, we should be paying payments for ecosystem services to people who live on the hills and the mountains around cities. So in Nairobi, for example, our water comes, that's where I am, it comes from this range called the Aberdares range, and it's coming too fast, it's coming too silted. The water board is having to spend a lot of money trying to clean it for the city. When there's big rains in the mountains, we have flooding in the city. And then when there's obviously, you know, when there's not enough, And so what's the problem? Part of the problem is that we've lost a lot of the biomass, the trees up there, but how do we get farmers to keep them on their land when what they would like to grow particularly is like vegetables for Nairobi and maize. So we really need, it's not, we shouldn't think of land that is cultivated as just producing food. It's also producing water. It's also capturing carbon. These are systems we all need. So I would very much like to see, and we do have a fund, Dorcas, in Nairobi, the Nairobi Water Fund. And there is a certain amount of payment going to the farmers that are on the Aberdare Range to try and keep trees up there so that the water, instead of rushing down when there's rain, actually goes into the ground, because that's one of the things trees do, is they drive water into the ground, and then it comes out in the groundwater in the city, right? And also it comes into the rivers slowly by slowly. The whole water system is complex, but we need to slow down the water, but we also need to really incentivize those farmers. And I would like to see pest systems for all those landscapes that provide water to African capitals. I think it's really essential. Addis Ababa is another one like that. Because people are pressed, they want to grow maize, they want to grow what we call sukuma wiki, which is the spinach, the kale that's very much eaten in Kenya. They may not want to put in trees. One of the things you can do besides putting in trees is give them a fruit, help them have fruit trees. So there's a lot of planting of avocados, because then you get ecosystem benefits, but the farmer also gets a product, right? So just to give you some of those kind of things, I think payment for ecosystem services is a great, great question, Dorcas, and I support them fully. And we need to work out imaginative ways to do it. And luckily enough, in East Africa, we have mobile money. So you can actually register farmers, but even carbon, for example, is a payment for ecosystem service. And you have organizations like EcoTrust in Uganda, which works through the Plan Vivo type of certification for carbon. And, you know, farmers on Mount Elgin are receiving money in their phone for growing trees over their coffee, which are at the same time helping to sustain the flow of water and stop landslides down to the lower parts of Uganda. So yes, payment for ecosystem services. Thank you, Dorcas.
Thank you very much, Kathy. That was quite explanatory. And I think we would also have to replicate the same interventions here in West Africa. And just shortly, before I jump back to Nora, I also have a question. We know that there is already a significant challenge of producing more food with less, quote and unquote, with fewer inputs. And this is also heightened by the need for agriculture to adapt to climate change, while also reducing greenhouse gas emissions arising from agriculture in order to mitigate against the risk of climate change. So what are the best options for agriculture to increase food production while simultaneously reducing its contribution to greenhouse gas emissions? What's the way out?
Is that for me, Dorcas?
Yes, that's for you, Kathy.
Okay, all right. So I just want to give you an example of something we're doing in India, and it's a good example. I don't know if you've heard about the fact that farmers in India are committing suicide because they get into debt. Yeah. There's been a it's the nice way of talking about it without using the word suicide, which is a very extreme, violent kind of word, is we say farmer distress. The farmers are distressed, right? They're in distress. And one of the problems with what happened in India is they faced severe food shortages and hunger in the sort of 50s and 60s, and there were real famines. And for people like Nora and my age, we were children in those days, and we might remember the pictures of very malnourished Indians, right? And then this thing called the Green Revolution came along, which was, a scientific miracle, and it was improved seeds, it was fertilizers, it was pesticides, and definitely food production increased in India, right? And these famines were less common, right? But there has been a very strong cost associated with this model. And for me, as an Africanist, you know, somebody who's lived here for 35 years, I would very much like Africa not to follow that a model of pesticides and fertilizers, because for one thing, besides the ecological issues that I was mentioning before, that you change your soil and so on and so forth, and we really need the pollinators, and we really need the termites, and we really need the earthworms and everything to keep the soil good, and so on and so forth. One of the problems is you get caught in this input trap, right? You have to keep spending on fertilizers. And so what was actually happening in the end with
une fin zéro.
Planting season would come up and they would take debt for improved seed, for fertilizers, for pesticide, and then something would come along like what you're talking about, a drought, right? And then their harvest wouldn't pay off even part of what they had spent. So one of the ways to be, and then they would get into distress, right? And that's when, and their whole families would go into a spiral, and then they would take their lives. And, you know, very, very large numbers of people. So what we are doing in India is trying to get them back to a much more agroecological approach, where they don't spend lots of money, and actually you can maintain the same level of production and have less inputs. Therefore, your profit goes up, right? If you use things like manure, if you use integrated pest management approaches where you're not actually buying pesticide, and then you, of course, you get more tomatoes, you get more this, more that. So it is possible. And, you know, obviously a lot of people are farming already in a very natural way in Africa. And they're, in fact, compared to global levels, the use of pesticides and herbicides is very low in Africa, but that's not saying it's a great way to go. And like in southern Burkina Faso, for example, I've seen, you know, we have a funny situation where we have a lot of young people needing to work in Africa, and something I feel very, very strongly about. But we also have a shortage of labor in some rural areas, and you can ask people to do things. And this actually connects with one of your later questions: is sustainable agriculture like expensive? There's somehow a shortage of labor. I guess in some areas, young people have gone to secondary school, so that sort of human strength and labor that was once there isn't there. But in southern Burkina Faso, for example, I've seen a lot of use of herbicides that can be very, very toxic. They wouldn't be the herbicides that you are allowed to use in Europe, for example, although we also have our problems with herbicides in the global north being associated with cancer. But, you know, there aren't young people around to do those things. So partly because they've gone to Ivory Coast, where they hope to earn more money from cocoa. So you get into these really complicated, and Nora mentioned the word systems, right? We have to think of what's happening in the rural area as a system, right? So you need young people in rural areas. I hope I haven't gone off topic, Dorcas, here, but you know, you need young people, you need their brilliance, you need their ingenuity, you need their physical input, and we can solve a lot of these problems and make rural areas, in my opinion, a whole lot more fun, right? Like our research in East Africa shows that young people don't want to migrate to Nairobi. And what we know about Nairobi is if you migrate here, your outcomes, your life outcomes are often a whole lot worse, right, than if you had stayed in the rural areas, because there's gangs, there's violence, there's crime, unfortunately, right? It can be very, very hard for a young man to make his way in Nairobi without getting caught in any of that. Right. So I think we need to just think about where are the people, where's the land, how can we make this land resilient, productive? And I like the idea of building up small rural towns into really interesting and vital places where people want to stay and young people want to stay in agriculture. And we do a good kind of agriculture that's sustainable and productive.
Thank you very much, Kathy. That was quite that's a valid point. Raised a call to action for young people. And thank you to everyone joining this webinar from all the parts of Africa. From Kenya, I'll say Asante Sana.
Asante Sana.
And thank you very much to the recommendations. I think we would also have to continue this conversation even after this webinar about driving sustainable policies to make these things work. It's not enough for us to talk about these things. We have to implement these things and put them into action for the greater good of Africa and for food sustainability and food security. Thank you very much for those valid points, Kathy. And Nora, back to you. Increased global food production. According to Kathy, she said it must come from a combination of factors and especially in the global areas where there may be scarcity of land. And furthermore, these new technologies like hydroponics and aeroponics, it may provide a means of increasing the intensity of food production through drought-resistant crops, through improved technology and all of that. So I just want to ask, how will sustainable habit restoration, what will be the role it will play in increasing food production using these improved technologies?
Thank you very much for this question, dear Dorcas, and also maybe to link also to what Kathy was saying. The issue is, for sustainability, the issue is not just to increase production. Is what to produce really, what is really meant to be consumed in order to have healthy people, nutritious food, and also, as you said, Kathy, without a lot of pollution through pesticides and more inputs and more inputs and more inputs that are draining our soils, that are draining our waters, that are draining our health actually. So one is first to ensure that we also make sure that we reduce food waste, because already 1/3 of the food produced is wasted, globally, and in Africa too. In Africa, it's not because we do not like the food that we are, producing. It's because farmers, or we do not have. There are no. There is still lack of investment in processing within the, access to markets, processing and adding value addition to the produce that is already coming, from the harvest, the post-harvest, etc., etc. So I think it's really also important to invest in the whole chain. That's why we are talking about agri-food systems, looking at the processing, at the trade, etc. And I think the good thing is that with the, for example, this, the Africa trade agreement that has been really developed and signed off by our African leaders is really a good point already, to make sure that there is also further investments in processing, so that and in trading at the local market, national, but also within Africa. For example, I'm just giving an example. Some countries in Africa are very good in producing. They have more specialized production of cocoa, or many other types of products that can be sold and consumed in other countries within Africa, and having this exchange of commodities, and also processing, solidarity between the different countries within Africa, and the private sector within Africa, and the youngsters within Africa, to really develop this as also a sustainable business. Yeah, so this is one which is really very important. Second is really the quality, what we are producing, not only 1 or 2 or 3 commodities. Patty talked about cashew. I think it's really important. This is just one example, or cocoa, or or different other products. I think it's really very important that we look at the basket of diversity of products, because first, it helps one to be resilient, because already economically, if you rely only on 1 or 2 or 3 commodities, you are dead if the you know, if the economy is dead because if you are relying on this commodity, maybe the prices are reduced, etc., etc. So what will farmers, you know, could benefit from it? You know, maybe you know, there will be really a problem and a negative impact on the economy. So there is a real need, and there is a big opportunities in Africa in getting different types of food products that are really very important in the diet, in the traditions, that Africans need to get again back with the pride, you know, to showcase the benefits of this product. And also they are adapted to the local environment, so they don't need more inputs, they don't need more investment and pesticides, etc., because they are naturally grown or already adapted by the farmers themselves. So I think this needs also to be taken into consideration. Last time I've seen there was one documentary, it was, you know, somebody sent it to me from TF1, you know, TF1, you know, from France, showing that now French farmers are using now sorghum instead of maize, sorghum from Africa, that is really, you know, for animal production and animal feeding, because it is more adapted to climate change now, because it is becoming drier and drier in France. This is one. And second, less inputs, etc., etc. It's a rain-fed produce, etc., etc. So I think it's really very important, and it's time to look at again those producers, those food products that we have, either as varieties, agrobiodiversity from one side, but also as food from the wild that we can also reproduce, of course, without putting pressure on nature. There are so many of them that we need then to bring back to the land while restoring in our restoration schemes. And I spoke before, for instance, about these initiatives like, for example, Africa's Great Green Wall, that is not only the Sahel region, even North Africa, even the Southern Africa. It looks really at the Africa's dry lands, you know, to sustain for sustainable development, including for food security, climate change mitigation, adaptation, biodiversity conservation and restoration, and nutrition and livelihood. So already looking at this initiative that has been backed actually by heads of state and government since 2007, endorsed by the African Union, and led actually by one of the main, important leaders in Africa, former Nigerian president. So all this, it gives us really the opportunity now to use the plants, African plants and species, whether they are trees, whether they are shrubs, whether they are grasses, whether they are for food or feed, or to get more ecosystem services, more pollination, etc., medicinal plants, and for healing, for feeding the livestock, etc. This is what we need to do. We should not look at isolation, the restoration agenda, and the agriculture agenda. We need to have them together. For instance, I think I have some numbers based on this assessment that we did, FAO did with the African Union Commission, the SADC, the Pan-African Agency of the Great Green Wall, and many experts from Africa. They did this continental digital assessment. Africa is the first continent who had this all data together. The first one who got it on agricultural land and environment, and we found that there is at least more than 300 million hectares in Africa's dry lands that need restoration. So let's work on those to restore them for small-scale farming, for protection of biodiversity, for the multiple uses that we need. And there are already actions on the ground. For example, I can give you the example of the Action Against Desertification program in support of the Great Green Wall, but FAO has been implementing with many countries of the Great Green Wall, including Nigeria. Nigerian agency of the Great Green Wall and the communities and the local partners, where there was like over 63,000 hectares between 6 countries, actually in total of 6 countries, have been restored using exactly the adapted, resilient plants that communities and farmers themselves have been selecting, but of course with the support of the scientists and scientific and technical officers in FAO and in also institutions like FRIN, Forest Research Institute in Nigeria, or and the agency and many other partners in Nigeria, for instance, just to give you this example. Second, I think Africa needs also to be modernized in terms of mechanization, technology, but the sustainable mechanization scheme, not mechanization, in a bad way. And here we have been having a lot of examples, and there has been already guidelines already even adopted by the African Union and supported by FAO on sustainable agriculture mechanization. Even within the Great Green Wall, we have been piloting and using this mechanized water harvesting techniques, using the mimicking the traditional half moons that communities and women and men, dig these half moons very hard, effort, using this Delfino with a tractor to really dig the same half moons, but deeper, faster, of course, in the type of terrain that can, of course, be used for this type of machinery, because we cannot distract things, the biodiversity. This is done in the bare lands where we can do this, of course, enrichment planting, natural regeneration. So there is a lot, to do in terms of production, not necessarily at the expense of the environment, at the expense of our soils and natural ecosystem, actually using the biodiversity as an ally, ally in this, sustainable production. The other, maybe just one other point that is really also important in terms of restoration of this over 300,000 hectares degraded, to turn them back to sustainable production of agriculture, livestock, and forestry systems, is also the seed, the availability and access to seed systems with all the different biodiversity. You don't need exotic species to restore our land. There are already adapted species, but farmers maybe do not have access to the seeds. Some of them, they have them because they have been using them as crops, but I think there are many other types of seeds, like seeds from trees, native trees and shrubs and grasses, that can be also developed, and value chains for seed systems developed for restoration of these lands, whether they are for agriculture, for forest use, or for life, or for pastoral use. So, there are different types of levels of action, and these all need to be implemented at the same time. We cannot say, okay, today we will do seeds, and tomorrow we will do policies, and tomorrow we do finance. No, everything should be going, at the same pace, and integrate and combine all these multiple supportive actions. So I think I will stop here, and if there is any other probing questions, I will be happy to continue the conversation.
Thank you very much, Nora. That was quite, it was intense, and you were able to draw up the different aspects or the different categories of the agri-food sector, and also the conservation, the ecosystem conservation, and merging the two together, that we shouldn't isolate this separately, but we should merge them together to achieve a resilient and sustainable food system. So quickly, in Africa, 70% of those who produce the food we consume are women, but we realized that in Africa, there isn't a enabling environment for women to participate, and there isn't any structure left for women to get in to be able to produce more. So what recommendation can you give to the African head of states as regards creating an enabling environment for more women participation in agriculture?
Thank you so much, for that question, Dorcas. And I am a woman, so I'm really like this question in particular, And of course, as you said, women actually who make up the majority of the sub-Saharan Africa, 413 million poor, with 80% of them living in rural areas, generally, of course, have less, lower incomes, less access to credit, and less decision-making authority, limited access to control over resources. This in turn, of course, increases their vulnerability to crises and climate impacts and more food insecurity and also, of course, vulnerability and poverty. So yet, as you said, women in Africa play a key role in food systems, in whether it is in agro-biodiversity conservation, natural resources management, food production, direct food producers, processing and preparation, marketing. And they are, of course, the holders of knowledge. They are our libraries, our walk-in libraries about, traditional seeds, species, their uses. And they are also wonderful innovators when it comes to sustainable and climate resilient agriculture and food system and adaptation practices. So this is why really, and I really like your question, this is why it is really important and urgent that we promote more and more women, particularly young women, as leaders in all decisions for food systems transformation to become sustainable and resilient. And my organization, so the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO, really places gender equality and the women's empowerment and leadership at the center of its mandate. And in Africa, for example, working with member countries and with partners in promoting women's access and rights over resources to information, financial resources, technologies, and also the diversification into, climate resistant crops, taking gender-based, knowledge and growth into account. For example, the use of local varieties and so on. And of course, we are also looking at the livelihood options that take into account women's constraints and needs. For example, the mobility, the childcare, because women, have different roles, not only as a farmer or as somebody, who sells produce in the market or process it, and also to support equal access to information and increase agency to act on it. So there is a real need. I think the call for action is to upscale women's technical skills and upgrading of their businesses, including readiness to seize mainly these opportunities opened by the Africa Free Continental Trade Area or Trade Agreement. And finally, of course, FAO promotes the active and meaningful participation of women and their organizations in decision-making and policy fora and processes. But we have also I really do not want just to say that women in rural Africa are just the farmers, but farmers, it's really very important. But also we have young women, not only as farmers, but as decision makers, as scientists, as practitioners, as students, as activists in NGOs or educators in schools, who are, I see really an uprising, voice from these women, and that we need to encourage them more and more. And because they are taking the torch and voice their concerns and recommendations themselves on the discussion and negotiation table. So more women we have out there at negotiations, for example, at the UNFCCC, COP, or at country and countrywide, multi-stakeholder decision-making platforms, better it is for rural women in Africa. We need, of course, to work on this with the increasing and incredible support of our brothers, the men, whether they are rural men, farmers, or decision-making, men or students or activists. So we need your support, men, also, in order to make sure that women really play their role as, in the transformation of, for sustainable and resilient agriculture systems, together with you, our dear brothers. So I think this is what I can, say in this field.
De l'innovation et de nouveaux challenges en Afrique.
Support and their hard work, and you, Dorcas, as our moderator here, and you, Cathy, and many other colleagues and the audience here, I think they will win it, and we need to support this work really very, very in a sustainable manner also, not just talking, but also in action, in making sure that women have the same role and equitable role and participation on different projects and programs and social protection schemes and land use rights and access to finance and education, which is really also very, very important in this field. Thank you.
Thank you, Nora. It reminds me of an old African proverb that says, when you educate a man, you educate an individual. But when you train a woman, you train a nation, because an educated woman in turn trains her children and trains everyone around her. Cathy, I'm not sure, would you want to also contribute to what Nora said about creating an enabling environment for women to excel?
Yeah, no, and in fact, before when we were talking to each other, I said, Nora, you handle the women question. And actually listening to her talk, a lot came to mind. And one of the things that we see is that in East Africa, and I believe it's probably the same in a lot of other places in Africa, is that women don't own trees. Trees are owned by men by and large, and very few women actually own land. And that's, obviously a really big problem. I'd like to give a shout out for things like family planning, because you also see not only women are doing agriculture, but they're also having maybe more children than they want, right? And on the family planning side, it's not that we have to talk about population control or any of those things. What we need to talk about is women having the number of children they want. So if they want to have 5, that's a very nice number, and they should be able to have 5, right? Rather than having 12 or 10 or that kind of number, right? So the important thing is girls staying in school as long as possible, and women having the right to decide the number of children they want. Yeah, not having unwanted pregnancies, because what you really see with African women a lot, but also in India, is that they're anemic, right? Because they're either menstruating, breastfeeding, or they're postpartum, or they're gestating a baby. They're pregnant. That's a huge burden on a human's body. And then you have these low diets that are low in iron and low in vitamins, because we've lost access to bush meat. Maybe we don't have enough chicken. We don't have enough eggs. And so I think women suffer, women have a lot to manage because they've got their reproductive roles and they're trying to farm. I think that there are a lot of, what I see is, Greta Thunberg, the young Swedish woman. I see African women playing that role in East Africa, Uganda, Kenya, all the young women who are doing the strikes for Friday, they're all young women. There aren't guys who are doing that. So women also pick up on that whole thing a lot. And I'm big friends with somebody called Echo, EKO, and then she has a longer name, who runs Urban Tree Revival, which is an NGO in Lagos. And I was very happy to be able to get her funding from an organization called One Tree Planted. And she's doing urban trees, which is really exciting. So I wanted to pivot a little bit since I've got the microphone, and I was thinking about this. We want young people in rural areas. We want both young men and young women to thrive. We know that agricultural areas don't just produce food, they produce water. But at the moment in Africa, they produce almost all the energy, right? So in something like Abidjan, something like 90% of people are cooking on wood fuel, right? So you're actually even putting another burden on landscapes, which are trying to produce food, which is they're also producing charcoal. And charcoal is a huge job sector for young men. I think you know that. I think you know that from West Africa. It's certainly the case here in East Africa and in Southern Africa. At the same time, that charcoal is actually, and the consumption of charcoal in urban centers is degrading rural landscapes. So in my organization, we would like to see much more sustainable charcoal, much more attention to how people are cooking in cities, because at the moment it's undercutting the resilience of rural areas. And at the same time, we totally understand that young people need to make a living from that. And another point I wanted to make is water, huge issue for rural areas. Almost everybody's rain-fed in Africa. And there's a nice thing you can think about, which is stop the water when it lands on your land, spread it and hold it and save it, right? And then one of the best ways to do that is with having more trees, right? And then you keep the water on your land and you get much higher yields, because when there's drought, we all know that the plants are going to flourish. So that's a kind of a permaculture concept: stop, spread, sink, save. But it's also got to do with mulching. And I really agree with Nora that we need some small scale mechanization, because people are having, even to dig 6 acres and turn it over with a hoe is unbelievable labor for people. And a lot of areas in Africa don't use animal traction. We don't want huge tractors, because they will actually just overturn the soil too much, and you'll get some ecological, but handheld tractors, all sorts of things like that are really important. And then just another point, because I wanted to make sure we cover a whole lot of different things, is I think we need to redo our agricultural syllabuses. I think people are still being trained in really old-fashioned types of agriculture, like get out there, cut the trees, remove all the weeds. Half of those weeds are really good things you might want to keep on your land, right? So I think we also need to have a revolution in what's being taught, and we need to integrate agricultural thinking much more with natural resource thinking. We're thinking about families, thinking about diets. And finally, one last thing I was going to say is I totally agree with Nora. We've got to keep the dietary diversity back on the land, right? Africa has unbelievable indigenous plants that people eat all the time, like the African Yam Bean. I know about that from Nigeria. That's one of the only crops in the world where you've got a bean. It's more nutritious than the common bean, and you've got a tuber. These are marvelous crops, and we need to try and keep them in our food systems, because good health depends not upon eating just like maize and a green vegetable on it every day. That's when you start to get stunting. That's what you see in Zambia. These very, very simplified diets where people don't have lots of good nutritious things to eat. So when you go home to the village, if that's where your parents live, and in East Africa, a lot of people who are in urban cities, they come from the rural areas, just look at all the different things that your mother's growing on her land. You'll probably find there's 17, 18 different crops that she's, and that's why you guys are smart and tall and all that kind of stuff, right? We don't want this stunting. We want this dietary diversity that gives micronutrients, because it's easy enough to get calories, but it's much harder to get the micronutrients, the vitamin C, the vitamin A, the vitamin D, the iron, the zinc, And that's what children need. And when they're lacking that, that's when you get this tragic stunting that we see so much of in places like Malawi and Zambia, where the diet is super, super maize-based. End of. Just wanted to make a couple of diverse comments there.
Thank you very much for the diverse comments. It was quite helpful, and it's even needed much now for us to look into the underrated crops and not concentrating our diets basically on carbohydrates like maize and cassava and rice. We should look into African yam bean and all other underrated crops in Nigeria. I think the IITA section of Ibadan, they are looking into also diversing the crops they research on by including crops like African yam bean, and I think that's quite a great development. So you mentioned rural areas going back and migration and young people leaving the rural areas to the urban areas, and this would definitely cause an effect in ecological biodiversity in the rural and in the urban areas. So I just want to find out what would be the risk of this mass migration from the rural to the urban, and how will it impact the climate change, and what will be the results in their cultural systems? What can you say about that?
Is that for Nora or was that for me?
That's for you.
Okay, yeah. So I feel quite strongly about this. I think there's a myth that young people don't like agriculture. I totally understand. What they don't like is not getting any money from agriculture, right? If agriculture were yielding, they'd be perfectly happy to stay in rural areas. I work with one group of young men in a slum, and they call it a slum. It's also like an informal settlement, if you want, like no plumbing, no roads in Nairobi. And many of them are broken, right? They're broken by drugs. They're broken by the gangs they've had to get into. They finally got out of the gangs when they had lost like 40 of their members from their community. Police, intergang fighting, crime, so it's not like there used to be a time when moving to cities gave you an advantage, probably like in your parents' time, Dorcas, and in my time, right? Because I'm probably even older than your parents. But now it doesn't look like people in Nairobi people in Kenya who move to Nairobi are better off. They have higher levels of malnutrition than people in rural areas. And then there's the insecurity, which they don't face in rural areas, right? So there's a human suffering element to moving to the city that I think we are not being totally honest about. And then there's the concept, Dorcas, of aspirations. So we've done some work on what rural people, young people aspire to in rural areas in Kenya. And people would like to stay in the rural areas, but they'd like to make a good income. And some of them don't want to do farming full time. They might also want to have something else, right? But if we had more things happening in rural areas and productivity was more, there's jobs like food processing, there's packing of food, there's transport, there's so many other things that could be done there. Plus, actually, if you really think about it, we need young entomologists, we need young soil people, we need young water people who are out there working with farmers. Actually, at the moment, we have all these, I paid in Uganda, I ran a big bursary scheme. I paid for 157 young people to go to forestry college. It's really hard for them to find jobs in forestry, and we need to create those jobs, right? And so, we need to use all those young people that we've educated and have them in the rural areas. What you see is that farmers are completely neglected. Nobody comes to visit them. They don't get extension services. Nobody's coming to say, you've got a nice piece of land here. This is what you could do with it. These are completely neglected people. Africa used to have extension services at one point, and then the structural adjustment of programs of the 1990s pretty much got rid of those. And I don't mean to be inflammatory, but it was the World Bank and the IMF who was insisting on structural adjustment, right? If I was a benevolent dictator, or if I was the president of a country, I would invest so much more in agriculture You know, we had this Maputo declaration, and Nora will know the facts of it much better than me, but 10% of budgets are meant to go to agriculture. And in most countries, it's like 3% of budgets or 2% of budgets, right? Agriculture is completely underinvested in, and yet that's where the bulk of people are living and drawing there. So it's a whole systemic issue, isn't it, Dorcas? And you know, I really like rural towns like Gulu in northern Uganda. It's really a happening place. You've got coffee shops, you've got cotton ginneries, you've got, you know, all sorts of processing going on. It's a good place to live as a young person. And I've funded some of the young foresters I funded ended up working there in various capacities, and they become go-to people. Everybody's going to them and asking them for their advice. They're on the local radio shows. It's not a more meaningful life living in Kampala for people like that, right? They're the local experts. So I really think that we need to make rural areas much more vibrant, and we might need to invest, governments need to invest more in agriculture. You know, we need to reach that Maputo Declaration level of 10%. Yeah, Nora, I think you'd agree.
Yes, I would agree really, Kati. And just maybe, Dorcas, if you allow me just to jump in and build on what Kati was saying regarding the 10% of investment in agriculture that need really to happen and to be supported by all the governments in Africa, as it was in the Maputo Declaration. Actually, and making the rural areas vibrant and attractive for the young generation, whether they are men or women. And maybe even if the young generation goes, of course, to urban, to the cities, to have their degrees and to finish their university, also to find a way to come back, actually to have a reason to come back and invest in the land of their fathers or the land of other neighbors, etc., etc. I think that's really very important, and this can be done. And I think the agri-food system, you know, wide approach, system approach, gives us this opportunity, as Kati, you mentioned, the importance of investing in improving and revitalizing the education system in agriculture, to have it more wider, integrate all the issues of climate, of biodiversity, natural resources management, processing, because even for the processing, for the business development, etc., for the youngsters to gain a living and to be really enterprise, you know, they are very intelligent, smart. So just build these enterprises, agriculture enterprises, for themselves and for the society and for the country. So this is one. And second, I think the other issue is related to the urban and rural linkages, because agriculture can not only, and I think it's coming more and more, and FAO is also supporting this work with governments, is really to ensure that we have also what we call urban agriculture, sustainable urban agriculture, because we cannot just, because actually the urban areas have been growing and expanded at the expense of rural land. Don't forget it, you know. So there is a need to recover those urban areas also to be used also for urban agriculture. And there is a lot on this coming out, and practices and projects and programs to have, you know, green cities initiatives, including urban agriculture, how to make it happen and how to make it work, and also for and attractive for the young men and women from one side, but also looking at the whole, you know, because you are also closer to the market, so the business growing and the digitalized markets, etc., etc. And third, to look also at urban forestry, you know, make the cities better and healthy and safe spaces and resilient to climate change, using the trees and the green spaces in the cities to make really a better life in these cities. So like bring in a bit of the rural benefits to the cities also, you know, bringing encompassing or getting nature within the cities, going back to the cities. And I think this is a really a tremendous opportunity with this Green Cities initiative. And actually this month in July, we have organized, and thank you very much, Kati, you have been also participating actively in this work, the first Africa Forum on Urban Forests, where we talked about the role of urban forests and urban trees, trees in the city, also for growing, for agriculture, but also for resilient cities. So, and the link with the rural areas, which is really very important. That's why the system should not be only looked, the sustainable and resilient food systems should not only look at the rural area, but also together with the urban areas, and looking, as I said, in the beginning, at the different sectors. It's really at the cross sector, from the trade to the production, to the environment, to the finance, to the market, to the policy and land use planning, and so on and so forth. Finally, you have touched one point, Kati, related to the extension services. Okay, that's really very important. And this is the role, for example, of urban, how can I say, our young generation who is really in cities, and if they want to invest more in the rural areas, having this also path of supporting extension services. For example, within FAO, we have been supporting communities, farmers, in what we call the farmer field schools, or farmer pastoral field schools, or rural field schools. And even within ICRA, for example, Kati, you have what we call the centers, the rural centers, farmer centers, also to support and provide support to the farmers. Many times, not just to support the farmers, but also learn from the farmers. I would like really to make this point, because many people coming from the urban areas, researchers or, engineers, etc., going to the land, to the field, learning from farmers, but are they really going back to give back to the community and to the farmer? Sometimes, it's questionable. I think there is also a need to go back to the community and support and invest in the community also, and make sure that these linkages really work, and that we look at it really in a wider system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nora. Please do not forget to drop your questions in the Q&A chat box. And so the two facilitators can take our question. We have a question for Kathy in the chat box from Musa Ibrahim in Nigeria. He asked, hello, Kathy, please, could you tell us more about hydroponic agricultural activities and how it is greatly responsible for carbon emissions, and is hydroponic safe and a sustainable solution? That would be for Kathy.
Yeah, I think I'm going to be short-lived on that question, because I'm not a hydroponics person. And I think maybe Nora is the person to answer that, or maybe the gentleman in question actually knows quite a lot about hydroponics himself. I'm interested in water for sure. And hydro has got to do with water. What I'd like to say is that Africa used to have great big fish-filled rivers that are now almost empty of fish and are seasonal because they're not running all year round anymore. And we know that's because of the removal of forests. And if you're somebody who wants to work on water, I would work on the big landscape picture as well. And why do we have these rivers that used to be, you talk to anybody my age, like in their 60s or 50s or whatever, and they'll say, when I was a young person, that river over there, we could swim in it. There were fish, and now it's a trickle, right? That's a disaster, right? And we don't talk about it that much. And it's got to do with how we're handling land. So I think I won't go any further on that since I'm not a hydroponics expert, but thank you very much for your question.
Nora,
Yeah, Dorcas, what I suggest, even if of course I work for the Food and Agriculture Organization, and we have, you know, different type of sectors, including agriculture, forestry, and biodiversity, land and water, etc. So, you know, fisheries and aquaculture. What I could say, you know, of course, I am not a specialist of the matter, but what I could say, I think it would be good. I can follow up on that. And if I can, I don't know if you can let me know to whom I should send some information more about what FAO also is doing. I know that FAO is supporting in many countries the work on aquaponic as well as hydroponic. So with some case studies that could really provide some insights, you know, better technical insights that I can do today with you as a senior forestry officer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nora. Of course, you can forward the information to the 1111 and 12 Foundation. They will disseminate the information across their social media platforms, and their partners and members can also find the information there. So quickly, I just want us to divert a bit to organic farming. Of course, the major challenge of food production is to understand how increasing food production will reduce the negative impact on biodiversity and ecosystem services. So what do you think is the role of is organic production system? Is it a solution? What are the advantages and disadvantages of organic production systems in biodiversity, ecosystem services, the yield and the human health, particularly in a continent like Africa?
Okay, I just want to say something about that. And I want to talk about the opposite as opposed to organic. What I can say is that we've all heard of this caterpillar, the fall army worm. I think it probably damaged a lot of the Nigerian agriculture because it's making its way across Africa. Do you know about that one, Dorcas, the fall army worm? It's an invasive pest. Yeah.
The fall armyworm, yes, I do.
Yeah. So people have tried to spray it. They've tried everything, right? And pretty much nothing works, right? But what FAO and my organization, plus some professors in various places, show is that there's something like 150 species of parasitoid wasp. In other words, it's a little wasp that likes to bury inside the caterpillar and thereby kills it, right? That will actually handle that, right? But how do we get the parasitoid wasp on our landscape? These are indigenous to Africa. We're only going to have them if we keep like natural barriers of vegetation around our fields, not these huge cleared fields, right? So there are situations, and we will encounter more and more of them, where pesticides can't get you out of the problem. End of story, right? The only thing that can get you out of the problem are natural predators, which would be bats, insects, and birds, maybe, you know, I don't know, little lizards and stuff like that. That it's truly not a way that we're going to get ourselves out of a problem by getting more chemicalized agriculture. Therefore, there's a lot of strengths to organic, but you can't just like say, okay, organic, and we're going to do a massive field or something. It's got to be organic with taking care, you know, I think a better word would be like a nature-based approach, or a nature
to say that it's really important, the biodiversity. This is the key, because if we rely on monocultures, you know, croplands in monocultures, this really makes your crop vulnerable to pests and diseases, whatever, even it's in a forest or in an ocean or on land, on a crop. So that's why it's really very important, again and again, to say it again and again, that biodiversity is the answer. And of course, it's part of this organic, what you said, Dorcas mentioned, but I would even spread it further, expand this notion to look at it as, you know, agroecological practices, because organic is part of these agroecological practices, or even say, you know, looking at an ecosystem-based approach, at a landscape-based approach, you know, not looking just at your farm. Of course, you're looking at your farm, but also at the whole landscape in order to create the enabling environment that would support the resilience, the health, and, you know, great, you know, yields and the diversity. And again, the production and the yield, we should not just look at it at one species or at one crop. The answer is really diversity, either in terms of biodiversity, which gives you then diversity in your basket for health and for food and nutrition. And it gives you also diversity in terms of cash, in terms of economic and livelihoods. Because if in your land you have, instead of having just a crop of, you know, land only, you have like maize, punto, that's it, or having a land with what we call the agro combined, you know, agro silvopastoral systems, like including, I don't know, for example, trees that will give you gum arabic, for example, that, you know, it has an international market and it's local species adapted to the, and it gives fertility, and it will also provide fertility and other livestock, if you, because it gives you manure, so it will give you also this organic way of, you know, fertilizing your soil and your health of soil. I think this is the main, you know, answer. I'm just picturing it really, monoculture with the diversity of the whole, what nature, Mother Nature in Africa really gives us. Whether we are in a very dry area, because this is the case, even in the driest area in Africa, we have this wonderful diversity adapted to the drought and adapted to the you know, the type of soil and so on. Even in the driest area, you can find this diversity. And then, of course, not talking about the wetlands or the more humid areas that have more rain, or you have also the wetlands themselves, etc. So I think we need to make sure that we assess what nature can offer, and what we can also offer ourselves to nature, you know. And when I say, no, I'm not here for philosophical, really. Look, I am an ecologist, of course, on my background, but looking really at what people need, what can people offer, need from, you know, multi-purpose, either for feed, for food, for health. You know, many people in Africa, we are still, you know, using, you know, the dawa, you know, some species and the honey and different medicinal plants from Africa that are part of the landscape. So we need really to look at the different multiple uses and species. And just to complement on this, you know, issue related to the ecosystem landscape approach to versus just the monoculture crop, we need also again to pastoral or agroforestry systems, no? And to assist, of course, to achieve this, we need you know, assistance of countries, you know, the governments and the technical institutions to conserve this genetic pool, no, the genetic resources for food and agriculture. And on the pest and pesticides management, yeah, we need really to reduce the reliance on these pesticides by adopting an integrated pest management approach and also uphold sound management of the pesticides themselves, because even if you use some pesticides, you need to know when you should put it, the quantity, so that you do not harm. Even when you have to use it, we need to use it really in a way that doesn't harm the consumer's health, the environment health, and so on and so forth, and also building like the resistance to this type of pesticide, because more and more you put pesticides, more and more you create resistance from this from these pests. And of course, we need really, of course, to encourage, we have already the answers, the solutions on the ground. They are just maybe small scale, they need to be scaled up, and this is needed really to be done between farmer to farmer. We need to look at what our fathers and grandmothers and grandfathers have been really doing before, and maybe support it with more adapted technology, more access to markets, recycling, and trying to have this circular and solidarity economy, and so on. And one particular thing that I think we don't find it, I don't know if we still find it somewhere in the world, but in Africa, as farmers, I think we are looking at a community level. I think what is good is the solidarity also between farmers. I think this is very important, and it's not something that we will have to to import as a way of work or living. I think this is also very important. This would really help also to make sure that to scale up this landscape approach, the exchange between farmers of their varieties and associations or cooperatives, to ensure that they can, of course, work together to address their problems and their issues, supported hopefully by the young generation and the extensionists and the farmer field schools and many other types of technical support and financial support that they can get. And yeah, so this is just what I wanted also to add on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nora, for your call to action as to increasing the scaling up solutions like the agroecological based approach, the natural based adaptation, and the ecosystem land based approach to enhance farmers, and the solutions about increasing crop varieties, the integrated pest management approach. This is to all participants. Please, we can share these messages across all social media and make sure that after talking about scaling solutions, you made mention of farmers field approach. What the best approach can we involve players across the chain, from the farmers, the researchers, the advisors?
We don't have much more time, or we have no more time. We've got to really get it. The trouble is, a lot of people still don't get it. And, there's a lot of people in the aid sector, at the World Bank. Sorry, I don't want to be down on the World Bank, but, in the big, big multilateral financial institutions, let me call it that, in English, British government, in African governments. And I just want to give one example. In Uganda, people thought, oh yeah, we need more oil, cooking oil, because we're importing too much oil from overseas, and this is bad for our foreign exchange. And then they kind of developed a sunflower seed sunflower oil thing, but they didn't give the right kind of advice to farmers. They said just well, unfortunately, a lot of the trees were the shea trees, the shea butter trees, which is also the source of a very nutritious oil for all the people in northern Uganda, right? So there isn't really systems thinking or joined up thinking that's going on. So, you know, right from how we learn agriculture in primary school to, you know, the ministries, we need to understand that this whole thing is linked together, but also you know, production, sustainable production is what to produce. And I don't want you to think me and Nora, we're kind of like hippies or something. And we just want you to like happy stuff all over the landscape. We understand that rural communities are producing for cities and they're producing stuff for export, right? And that's the market pretty much, right? And then they're your former minister, Adesina, you know, who went to the African Development Bank, you know, he had these good ideas of reducing food imports like wheat, right? And Nigeria imports a lot of wheat, but you can also substitute maize flour, right? Make flour from cassava. So we need a lot of creative thinking.
That it's been very useful. Just quickly, we have some questions. Just quickly round up, and if we can just round up with these questions and probably give a call to action, so we can continue with our day. The first question is, please, may I know to what extent does urban silviculture
in cities story that Nora was talking about? So I think it's really important. And I can also quickly, when Nora's talking, I did an article about what Kampala is doing for urban forestry, right? And they've got a whole urban forest management plan. And this is a model for all capitals in Africa. And they've calculated how many trees they need to offset the carbon generated from the city. So yeah, trees in cities, hugely important, not just for carbon, very, very important for people. And I'll look for that article right now when you ask Nora her question.
Maybe to add, Dorcas, thank you very much, Kati, for bringing that up, and also certainly I will follow up after with more materials on urban forestry and its role in building resilience in cities, and of course carbon, you know, climate change adaptation and mitigation. I don't have now the figures, but for example, at least one figure that I would like to give you is that based on this assessment we did in Africa, we have found like Africa hosts, you know, hosts 7 billion trees outside forests, okay, and outside forest, and part of it, of course, in cities, which is really a very, very, very good news. And certainly, as Kati was saying, these are really supporting from one side the health, but also biodiversity, as well as at the same time carbon sequestration. But of course, the figures, I could maybe give you figures later, but it would of course depend on this, on the type of trees and the type of you know, how many, the density, and so on and so forth. So we can do that. We can forward some material on that later, and we will be having very soon this report on this first Africa Forum on urban forests that we have organized with the UN Habitat, actually in July 2021, and also can share that with you with so many case studies from mayors and from different institutions, including of course Kati and all the work. And there is actually currently an ongoing preparation of a roadmap to take action. Really, what are the required actions for increasing, building resilient cities and healthy cities and having better spaces in our cities in Africa. So this is what I wanted also to add on this.
Thank you very much, Nora and Kathy, for your time and your answers to the questions I've been able to ask, and also the audience have been able to ask.
Thank you.
It's been quite a lot of conversations and back and forth about how to create an enabling environment and how to build a sustainable and resilient food and agricultural system in Africa. I just want to also thank the E1111 and 12 Foundation for their time and also for the judgments they have to create conversations around building enabling environments and also driving conversations that will be beyond us and also will be implemented if it gets to the policymakers. Thank you very much for our partners and for everyone who also joined this webinar. I'm so excited to also have been able to host this session, and you can also join us next week, same time, and for the week 3, the third edition of this webinar, and we'll also be talking about financing a grain recovery post-COVID-19. Thank you very much for your time, and we have come to the end of this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dorcas, for your, also to the audience for their patience with us and their support, and also their actions on the ground wherever they are in Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you just so much. I've really enjoyed it. And if I come to Nigeria, I'm definitely gonna.
Quand je suis au Nigeria, je vais organiser des réunions pour voir. Merci à tout le monde. Merci à tout le monde et j'ai réellement apprécié ce panel.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.